Vera, part 2. We're here. How are you doing?
I'm doing really well. Well, currently my daughter is recovering from her first daycare cold. She's kind of on me right now. So if you hear any weird noises, it's definitely her, not me. And wanting a little bit of comfort at the moment. So yeah, so my husband took care of her all morning long, but she reached a point where she wanted her mommy. So
Oh, bless.
right.
I think we all reach that point at some point in our life, don't we? We all want our mum. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us. We're actually recording this a week later, hence why we both look slightly different. I think my beard's probably grown a little bit. My hair's probably got a little bit longer. But yes, we're back for part 2. I was just saying to Vera, this is for the benefit of everyone else. I was saying to you before that I watched over part 1, and I do think we covered a lot of ground, especially with your research and trying to bring the consumer and governments into this. Oh, bless you! Into this dialogue around ethical consumption. You know, more broadly sustainability, and your wonderful work on places and spaces. I think what I failed to do was I think I'm guilty of this a lot of the time. I failed to ask you that "so what" question, and so I think that's what I'd like to try to do today. Um, and I think the way I'm going to ask it is that as we spoke about in part 1, spaces and places are both created by and created for consumers, sort of out there in the world, which we're all going to transition to, whether it's this year or next year, but we're going to transition to at some point. And I think one of my fears is that we go from isolation and seclusion and kind of a segmented society into pure hedonism or hedonism. I don't know how to pronounce it, but we splurge, we all go, bars, clubbing and spending, and there's a real danger, especially for the most vulnerable people in society, if we go ahead and do that, demand and supply. So spaces and places are both created by us and for us. Now, within the home, we have agency over that, but very much out there in a market, it is created for us, to some degree. So that lengthy introduction, what is it? And this can both be from your research and just from your opinion, Vera. What is it that consumers should be demanding from business in terms of the spaces and places that they want to inhibit?
Yes. So I think this is an incredibly complex one because, on the one hand, we are so excited by the idea that the pandemic is hopefully going to end soon, hopefully.
Yeah.
And the 1920s, they were legendary for a reason. They still are. And some think that perhaps, we're going to have a 2020s, but then of course we also have to think about what happened after the 1920s, etc. Um, so how can we also perhaps learn from history? How can we perhaps do it in a more socially just, in a more kind of sustainable way? But on the other hand, we are also people who've been cooped up for such a long time in our own four walls, who perhaps feel that the place around them is kind of enclosing. Maybe they have horophilia, they're kind of craving these new spaces. So I think what we have to demand is that perhaps some of the more sustainable ways are carried on into the future. So really concretely, that there is still a lowering of carbon emissions, that perhaps there are quite a few meetings that are quite possible via Zoom and Teams, etc., and that we actually really kind of cut down on transport that isn't needed. and cut down on perhaps meetings that could just be an email as
Yeah,
the meeting, etc. So this is in terms of sustainability, but we also really have to ask ourselves, like, how can we, for instance, hedonistically consume, which is good, but at the same time, how can we perhaps do that in a more sustainable way? I mean, theoretically, it is possible. And for instance, Kate Soper's seminal work is on this notion of the sustainable hedonism. This kind of the hedonic green consumption, and actually find real pleasure in consuming in more green ways. So that is perhaps one way to go forward as well. But what we have seen during the pandemic is, of course, that there was a huge shift into the online sphere. And my research, the paper that Andreas and I also, after my PhD project came to an end, published from that, is very much looking at these digital spaces, and it's looking also at some of the major advantages that these spaces bring. So for instance, there can be a real kind of recharging and multiplicity within them. There can be also a scaling up within these spaces. So we should perhaps also look at what these digital spaces can really give us, and how we can use that to reconnect. Just to also go to Daniel Miller's project on social media, the anthropologist who works at UCL, he also found, together with his team, actually, that social media are more likely to connect people, and perhaps even to reinforce traditional patterns and tribes, etc., rather than make us so narcissistic and hedonic, etc. So perhaps we can also look to the digital and try and take away the positive aspects of it and try and manifest them more in our lives. At the same time, in our paper, we also talk about that the digital sphere, while of course there is still embodiment in the digital sphere, I think a lot of the digital sphere had previously been talked about as this kind of disembodied space, and it isn't that, because as we argue in the paper, we always log into the digital space via devices. We're still occupying our own bodies. So I don't think that there's this complete disembodiment. But at the same time, we also argue that there isn't this multisensoriality in the digital. So how can we bring back that multisensoriality and that first sip, of the cocktail or mocktail that just is everything for us, like sitting in the early summer sun in a cafe, actually seeing people pass by and enjoying those aspects of it, and hugging people and being able to smell them again. But at the same time, also sustain some of the advantages, and perhaps also some of the plain convenient parts of moving parts of our everyday existence into the digital.
yeah. There's, I can't remember exactly what it is that you said, but you mentioned it at the beginning there, and it really shone a light on something for me, in that there's a bit of a tension, or there's a bit of a paradox in this for me, in so much as, companies, especially those that are shareholder driven rather than stakeholder driven, which, I think, I don't have the research or the numbers in front of me, but I think it's fair to say that most are. There is a need, or a demand from shareholders for growth, always more, and then obviously within that, I think one of the things that underpins growth, especially in retail spaces, is consumption. To have more growth, you need more consumption, you need more products, you need more volume and units moving off the shelves, for example. But everything that we're talking about is, I think, from where we are in the world at the moment, or where we are at this point in history, is to either pause, or potentially in some spaces roll that back slightly. but there's a circle that I can't square in there. So how do we go about convincing businesses, organization, markets, industries that beyond sort of the obvious environmental climate emergency and things like that, how do we go how do we go about convincing them that we do need to pause on consumption habits, or we do need to potentially in some cases take a step back?
Yes, that is the most difficult square to circle, I think. And it is, as you said, Ollie, it is because of this definition of there being a need of expansion. So an economy always needs to expand. However, I'm not saying that I'm going to square the circle in the next 10 minutes, but
If you can, that would be great.
never going to go viral, right?
Yeah.
This one's unlikely, but GDP is set up in an incredibly simplistic way, right? So there are many crude jokes about, I'm not even sure I want to go into this, but basically, like, if you eat this shit, I'm gonna give you £1,000. Okay, well, you know what? I've just spotted another one. I'm gonna pay you the £1,000 back if you eat it. And then a bystander passes, and they tell the story. And it's like, oh, great, GDP has just increased by £2,000. So it is really, really simplistic.
It's a blunt force object, isn't it?
So it's really, really blunt. It's really simple. So perhaps then we can actually, if I dare carry on this this simile, with materials that are already in the world, to carry on to perpetuate GDP, because at the end of the day, growth in GDP alone doesn't necessarily equate further kind of production of raw materials or extraction of raw materials. It doesn't necessarily do that. So if we're going to hold on to this definition, which is a question in its own right, then we can think about how to repurpose things. And what I find quite baffling, this is going to first seem off topic, but that, for instance, vegan cuisine can often be just as expensive as a steak. Or, it's marginal, and it's just like, well, sorry, but the raw materials clearly don't reflect the price difference or lack thereof, but it's the human labor. And actually putting on a really good roasted cauliflower steak on a table, with the right kind of sauce, etc., that requires a lot of human labor, that it requires expertise. And therefore, GDP, just at the point of the restaurant, say, is going to stay roughly the same. Of course, then there's also the supplier chain, etc., and that can get quite intricate. So what was supplied to, for instance, produce the beef versus the steak, etc. But there are many, many ways in which the whole notion of GDP can stay the same, and in which consumption and perhaps even hedonic consumption can be kept up without the need of a constant harmful extraction of materials, or, for instance, repurposing of things, reclaiming, etc. And I think there needs to be a lot more engineering that is specifically geared at, for instance, there are cradle to cradle engineers, etc. There are zero waste concepts out there. And at the moment, it's a little bit about, making it sexy and cool. So for instance, a lot of the discussions around veganism, they're like, well, I'm not a vegan myself, by the way, but a lot of my food is plant-based. But it's all about, well, if it's just a cruelty argument or just a CO2 argument, you're going to make people feel bad about themselves, and that's not necessarily going to be as effective. And I spoke with my dear colleague, Professor Gianna Eckert, about this, and we were both saying that there has to be this element of what's in it for you. For instance, you're going to look slimmer and sexier, and your skin is going to glow more, what have you. And so in her previous research, also with Tim Divini et al., they were looking at the myth of the ethical consumer. And perhaps there are ways, though, in which we can responsibly repurpose and reappropriate concepts within economics, within production, etc., that don't end up in complete planetary demise.
Yeah.
So there is enough brain power out there. There is enough technology, also people who are capable of developing this technology. And yes, maybe some of the definitions could be rethought, but GDP, for instance, doesn't necessarily have to die on the stake of this if people are attached to it.
Yeah, and I know there are alternative metrics or indices. I believe donut economics has grown from I think it was from the Netherlands, the city of Amsterdam maybe. I know there's one called the Happiness Index as well. But there's I really like because it's practical, right? You have to sell ideas. You do have to sell ideas. So this, what you've just mentioned about, let's take veganism, regardless of what you think about it. If we got the Ogilvies involved and the Saatchi and Saatchis and package it up with a nice bow and made it sexy, then maybe more people would buy into the idea.
Yes.
And
Yes. So I think one of the practitioners who's just done a tremendous job of making vegetables sexy, basically, is Ella Mills, the entrepreneur of Deliciously Ella. So you can
yeah,
say, people have different opinions about perhaps her or some of her practices. Personally, I'm an admirer, but I know that there have been some really kind of bitey headlines, for instance, in The Guardian of all places.
yeah.
But I think that she has actually done a tremendous job where others just talked about how the ideal way of going forward would be. And she has actually done a really, really great job at getting people to eat a lot more vegetables.
Yeah,
So I think there's also something in actually just doing it, not just talking about it, but actually also going forward with it, doing it, and bringing about positive change. And there isn't always necessarily a perfect way, and we're going to be learning by doing. And what, for instance, Deliciously Ella, or Ella Mills rather, has talked about is that apparently people really hate it, when you preach to them.
yeah.
So it's more like making something seem attractive in its own right, making it seem enjoyable rather than pointing fingers. So
Yeah,
that's
absolutely. I don't think that you're going to change anyone by pointing a finger and blaming them and saying you're wrong because you tell someone they're wrong and they're not going to listen to you, are they?
yes, yeah.
Vera, that's amazing. I really, I'm gonna, I think we've come back round actually because you've answered that so what question, or that why are we talking about it question. The ideas are there, the ability to shop more ethically or consume more ethically, is there. We just have to sell it better. So
That GDP could still work. We just have to move away from expansion only being to extract new commodities. Perhaps it could also, yeah, and some business models will have to change. That is a fact. And of course, that's always a difficult message to transmit. But on the other hand, the faster that is done and the more responsibly that is done, the more people can also gain from it economically, actually, rather than being the ones who are left behind, say, for instance, like Donald Trump steelworkers, etc.
yeah, yeah, and I think if we take a bit more of a thoughtful approach to GDP, I'm not saying that we need to redistribute all the wealth across the entire world so everyone's the same. I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is that if we take a more thoughtful approach to it, we might be able to address the imbalance across entire value chains, which I don't think anyone could argue would not be a nice thing for us to do. Vera, that's great. I'm going to stop it there. Thanks for coming back for part 2.
Thank you so much for inviting me back, Olly. Really enjoyed it.
Pleasure. Hopefully we'll talk again next year.
Yeah.